We really feel passionate, and I'm dedicating the rest of my life to trying to protect our world's critical infrastructure. It's a big problem, and frankly, it's one that I think needs a lot of adjustments in terms of strategy, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I think a lot of people struggle to figure out what to do. Attacks are increasing, but yet spending against security controls is also increasing. So that means that we're not spending money in an effective way. And I want to make sure that we start getting more ROI based on the way we spend money. So this is not about applying security controls. It's fundamentally about your supply chain and building your network in such a way that it is resilient and it is secure. So let's talk about the oil and gas supply chain. Just broadly speaking, I think of it in three main buckets, even though this slide has five. It's really upstream, midstream, and downstream, and they're all connected so that oftentimes if there's an incident that occurs in one, it will impact the other. The other thing that's really important to think about relative to oil and gas supply chain is that it is typically mostly continuous. There's very little buffer capacity within the supply chain. There's some tanks here and there. And then, of course, on the transport side, there's different ways in which to bucketize that and buffer that. But it's very continuous and it's highly connected. And the other thing that's important to know is it's also vulnerable. And if you look at some of the biggest cyber attacks, one of the things that I think is interesting to me is that exploited vulnerabilities, or CVEs, are at the top of the list. I actually would have thought it was credential theft, but I think this is changing over time. And then malicious email, which we don't do anything about necessarily, is the third category. You could actually add phishing to compromise credentials and brute force attacks, because those are actually part of compromising credentials. But I'm going to come back to this, but I want you to keep in mind, if these are the ways people are getting attacked, how effective is our strategy at addressing these? So let's talk quickly about an example, a Colonial Pipeline attack, which was really an attack on an IT system that then caused the Eastern Seaboard to basically shut down to protect that fuel supply. The consequences were devastating. I mean, this was 6 days of an outage. There were long lines at gas stations. And, I think the main message here is that you really inherit the vulnerabilities on the IT side when your OT and IT networks get connected. And so, again, thinking about a strategy that addresses the reality that those things are connected. In terms of 2023, if you haven't read the Drago's 2023 year in review for oil and gas, I would highly recommend that. There were 30 known ransomware incidents. I don't know how many of those you read about in the news, but they definitely wasn't 30. And, most of these, 2/3 of them basically started within that IT environment. So that's just echoing what I just got done saying about this connection between the two environments. Another thing that I think is important to understand is that less than half of them had issues with, I'll call it, defensible architecture. In other words, there were some structural things in which they had built their networks that meant that the consequences would be more severe if there was an attack. And in this case, we're really talking about the lack of sufficient segmentation. And then 21% had poor remote access security. That may sound like a small number, but keep in mind, the hacker only has to be right once. So if they have 1% poor remote access security, you need to have a strategy that takes into account and really eliminates that threat vector altogether. And then one of the things that I think is kind of dawned on me and dawned on some of our customers recently, going back to my first point, that we're spending more money, we're getting worse results. When you think about all the money being spent on firewalls today, almost every attack that occurs already has a firewall in place, but it was not effective at stopping the attack. And I think we need to dig in and double click as to why that is the case. So this is from the IBM X-Force report. This is slightly different data than what we saw earlier, but this is basically shows that a majority of the attacks leverage credential theft for initial access. And once they have initial access, they can move laterally, live off the LAN, and then deploy payloads, ransomware, establish backdoor command and controls, et cetera. They can do all kinds of things once they get that initial access. So they're not really hacking, they're just logging in using those stolen credentials.
Well, got a question, Tom, about, can you give some examples of these vulnerabilities and maybe why aren't firewalls stopping them?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons is that firewalls oftentimes rely on human beings to configure the rules and maintain the rule set adequately. So if there's a change in rules, or if let's say it's 3 o'clock, I was talking to a water facility in Texas, and they were telling me this story about at 3 a.m., they had to basically set the firewall to any rules to troubleshoot this problem they had. And they did it, and they got everything back working again, no impact to the public. And then he told me that it was a year later that he remembered that those firewall rules hadn't been changed back. So that's an example of this topic you're talking about. There's other issues too, though, and firewalls are increasingly seeing more and more CVEs that can be exploited. And I would say the third thing, which may be related somewhat, is that, how many firewalls have an admin portal that's an exposed web service so that the person who's actually administering the firewall has access to that web service. They have to just get the right username and password. But if they do, they're not only in, but they can actually control the firewall rules and turn them against the target. So I don't know, Cam, if that answers your question, but
yeah, I think that's the question that was asked.
Okay. All right. So another area that's interesting that I haven't heard a lot about is how the telco networks that are oftentimes used for WAN connectivity. And we think about oil and gas, we'll talk about this on the architectural diagrams. At the wellheads, the towers, along the pumping stations and compressor stations in midstream, you have oftentimes satellite, you've got LTE or cellular, and you're relying or trusting on that telco network to not expose your data, not expose that. You're trusting them to encrypt your data. And so we've actually seen conflicts between the IT security team and the OT team. The OT team wants connectivity so they can run their operation. It's really important. The IT security team's like, look, it's not secure, so I can't authorize that. So there's this tension between the two. And one of the great things about our solution, which I'll go into later, is we actually help address that where both teams win. The SANS Institute also showed that of the top 3 priorities for this next year, there's a huge shift that's taking place, moving from continuous monitoring and visibility tools like Nozomi, Armis, Clarity, TX1, Industrial Defender, SCADAfence, OT, Tenable OT, all these guys, and they're shifting to more protection focused. I think they're understanding that maybe our ROI is better if we're actually trying to focus on preventing attacks as opposed to just monitoring things along the way. I think both are important, and I would encourage every single potential prospect or customer to have a holistic strategy that encompasses both. So let's talk a little bit about the networks themselves. And again, these are 3 different ecosystems, if you will, upstream, midstream, downstream, and they're all interconnected. And that interconnected nature adds to the risk. So, stepping back a little bit before we get into some of these specifics, what is the strategy of the adversary? What's the adversary trying to do? The adversary is fundamentally trying to find a weak link. All they have to do is be right once. And so what's your strategy to protect yourself in lieu of their strategy? So this is kind of like that second level approach where you are anticipating what they're going to do, and then you have a plan to react to how they attack you. And I think to the extent it's not explicit, what I see a lot of folks doing are what I call whack-a-mole strategies. And that sounds bad, but it's very natural in a way. And what I mean by whack-a-mole strategy is if you think about the threats that you face, like it may be default usernames and passwords on certain IoT devices, cameras, et cetera. Those are going to be present. I'm sorry, you're just not going to get those out. They're going to be there. So if your strategy is dependent on you changing the usernames and passwords, default usernames and passwords on those devices, there's going to be a hole. Again, it just takes one. A whack-a-mole strategy would also be reliant on patching. And again, it's a good thing to patch, but it's not going to be good enough because 35% of all the CVEs that were discovered last year are what are called forever day vulnerabilities. So they're never going to be patched. The company who built that product may even be out of business. So a whack-a-mole strategy is not going to, patching is not going to work. There's going to leave holes. If you also are relying on cyber awareness training for your people, that's going to fail, right? People are going to click on links, maybe not as many as before and after the training, but still, it's a whack-a-mole strategy. And then talking about rotating your usernames and passwords every 90 days. Again, it's better than nothing, but fundamentally, it's a whack-a-mole strategy. And I would just, if you walk away with nothing else from this entire talk, I want you to think about a strategy that eliminates threat vectors as opposed to just tries to whack the moles of those that pop up. So to the extent, we can help facilitate that, I'd love to work with you in any way possible. So now going back to the specific oil and gas cybersecurity challenges, unlike the IT environment, you typically don't have dedicated OT security people. But if you do, there may not be as many, and there also may not be as highly certified as what you see on the IT side. And the other thing that you see is instead of a data center or a consolidated area or some buildings, networks, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of remote sites. In some cases, we were talking to a prospect yesterday that has like over 3,000 remote sites. And so that means that you cannot charge over $1,000 to protect every site, or it's cost prohibitive. And so you have that risk ROI issue. And then in terms of connectivity, you've got to make sure that you've got redundancy so you don't unintentionally stop production. And it needs to be encrypted so you don't have issues and risk related to those connections. So, that if you translate those challenges to the requirements, it means you need to be able to do a remote install that any production operations person can do. So that means they don't need to be able to do command line, for example. I mentioned the cost-effective things. It needs to be less than $1,000 a site. And then you need to be able to support, it needs to be transport agnostic and block attacks. So, I mentioned a little bit about some of the strategy pieces, and we talked a little bit about firewall rules. But the real problem with security is the humans, mostly. Humans are unpredictable. Humans are fallible, myself included. Maybe not Cam, but we relying on training is not a great strategy. Hope's not a great strategy. It's better to try to eliminate the threat vector. So I'll give you a very concrete example here. We just got done talking about the issues around usernames and passwords and how those are a nightmare. Nobody likes them either. And even the multi-factor authentication, which is a great improvement on the security, it still adds some friction. So what we did as a company, we made the decision. I spent 10 years at Apple. We wanted to make the decision to eliminate usernames and passwords so that you can't be socially engineered out of them. And this decision was made years ago. And there was this event that happened back in November of 2022 where there was a shot across the bow of the world in terms of technology transformation, and that's when ChatGPT was launched. And since ChatGPT was launched, the incidence of phishing emails is up 1,265%. That's a big number. Phishing emails are through the roof, and worse yet, they sound and read much more believably. So eliminating the ability for them to extract those credentials is a very powerful tool that we think provides protection both yesterday as well as into this AI future. So they can up that to 3,000% phishing emails. But if you don't have a username and password to be phished, doesn't matter. And then we talked a little bit about how firewalls are being involved in breaches. And these are the three things that I kind of mentioned. So, I think I see a shift happening, Cam. I see a shift happening from this monitoring and trying to detect issues quickly to really trying to think, can we protect or prevent these incidents in the first place? And it's going to be much higher ROI. So what we have done, we've compared this to the firewall approach, which we just said is involved in 100% of breaches. It doesn't really stop them. It's good. It's just not foolproof. Of course, nothing is. But we've demonstrated that we stop 80% of breaches at least, and we can deploy in 1/10 the time of a firewall in an OT environment. We don't require downtime. You don't have to re-IP your architecture. You can deploy this as an overlay quickly. And we pair with some of those monitoring visibility asset discovery tools to give you a full picture of what's going on. We also don't require the same ongoing headcounts, half the ongoing cost. So the OpEx drops, the CapEx drops, and then in terms of the subscription, it's 1/4 the cost of firewall solutions. So it's more effective and it's faster to deploy, less ongoing and initial cost. Why would you want to not use Blast Shield? So looking at the requirements here, we're talking fundamentally about the building a secure network. It's about secure connectivity, and that enables important operation capabilities that rely on that connectivity, but you want to get that in a way that doesn't put you at risk. And so there are many specific issues related to oil and gas, intrusion, eavesdropping. You've got remote sites that can be discovered once people are performing reconnaissance. They can discover them, then they can exploit them. There's also physical security issues in oil and gas. Let's not be, Pollyannish and say this is all, digital. There were an example I heard about, people essentially hammering locks on fenced cages. There were people that one company had 2 oil tankers that were stolen. They blew up. Unfortunately, no one was hurt. But there's all these kind of incidents in oil and gas which you don't hear about, and it can be it's a very challenging environment relative to health and safety as well. I don't know if you guys watched Landman, which was a little bit over the top in some areas, but I think it gave you a little bit of color of some of the realities that people are facing. So in terms of the way to address those deficiencies, I think the first thing that we realized was you need to cloak the network such that no device is visible unless you're already authenticated. And that presupposes that you can't authenticate through a web browser, or else you're already exposed. And so we have a kind of a handshake process that's very fast, very efficient. It's passwordless, it's multi-factor, and users absolutely love it. But it enables you to authenticate to a cloaked environment, and you'll still see nothing. Even if you're authenticated, you have to have the permission set up in a zero trust way that allow you to see and access and control the devices that you should see and access and control. So vendors, for example, you can control very granularly what vendors can see and what vendors can touch in an environment. And the customers, again, love that. This creates a virtual air gap. It stops people from performing reconnaissance. One of the other things about AI, other than just the personalization that's incredible and the deep fakes, they can automate things and make things much faster with less human intervention. So you can get automated reconnaissance. Well, guess what? If the packets are getting dropped, doesn't matter. Again, another mechanism by which we are AI resistant. And then device cloaking, you can hide those OT devices from internal discovery, and it can help you against insider threats, which are an issue. Doesn't stop them all, but it can protect you against them. Now, in terms of secure remote access, I mentioned the phishing resistant MFA, again, patterned after Apple Pay. If you haven't experienced this, like everybody who I show this to, they're like, can I please get that for everything? I was at a bar last night and there was a CEO of a bank who was whining and belly aching about all the problems he has in security and just how much friction he faces. And I talked to him about this approach. He's like, can I get that yesterday? And I'm like, well, actually, no, because we're focused on oil and gas and really critical infrastructure. I'm sure there's providers out there that can help them, but we're very clear on our mission. We also deliver this kind of peer-to-peer full mesh, which really gets at something that's also a critical requirement in OT, which is around performance. You don't want to have situations where a switch or router is getting traffic backed up because you don't have enough performance. PLC misses a command. They can fall on the floor if you're doing active scanning. So performance really, really matters. And when you're talking about these remote sites that may be dependent on satellite, the available bandwidth is less. And if you don't have a very robust solution that's efficient, it can mean that you're going to get a lot of retrans. And then just-in-time least privileged access. This again gets to the ability to set up and control contractor access for a certain period of time with automatic revocation.
So Tom, we actually had a question come up on the Q&A. So with both the two things you just described as well as the segmentation, that really is just zero trust access that we're really talking about, right?
Yeah, these components are absolutely zero trust remote access, and there are several providers that do this. I think what's unique about us is that we bring in that zero trust network access that other providers provide. We do it in a passwordless way, which I don't know of other people who do that. But then we layer on the cloaking and the segmentation so you get a complete solution that is strategically aimed to eliminate threat vectors. It's not the whack-a-mole strategy, it's the threat vector elimination strategy. And that may sound like a subtle difference, but it's a powerful way to protect yourself. And by the way, it's also cheaper. So talking a little bit about the segmentation is, we can allow you to segment to whatever degree you want. When you're talking about a well pad, it doesn't make any sense when you have like 5 or 10 devices at a well pad. It doesn't make any sense to like micro segment within the well pad, but you do want to isolate well pads to the extent you possibly can. But that's a decision that the production and security people can decide. So that level of granularity. And then we've got this ability to do layer 2 isolation, even on devices that are deployed on the same LAN. So if you have devices on the same LAN, we can actually force layer 2 isolation, and without having to require hardware deployment. And that's something that's exciting to some of the customers we've been talking to recently. And, if you're not having to deploy hardware in every situation, it can also save you money. And I also want to mention just about scale, because this comes up quite a bit. A lot of the people we're talking with are big. I mean, in oil and gas, small is big. You have thousands and thousands of devices in a small kind of outfit. And, I think I'll talk about it in a little bit later about how we approach scale, but there's one customer that we have that's a $30 billion oil and gas company in terms of market cap. And they deployed 15,000 devices secured 15,000 devices in 1 month. So scalability is something that is in our DNA as a company. Our CTO built software that the major world's carriers depended on for DPI. So we've got this built into our DNA, and it's something that, you've got to make sure that our solution scales, or you're not going to protect critical infrastructure, because there's literally millions of devices out there that need protection. In terms of our ability to deploy, we can deploy in many different environments. We can deploy on x86 commodity off-the-shelf hardware. We can deploy in virtual machines, ESXi instances. We can deploy in containers. We can deploy in Kubernetes clusters. Most of what we work on are around the gateways, but we also have software for agents. If you have a data historian or you've got a VPC in the cloud, you can also connect that up. We can connect on 4 different flavors of Linux, Mac OS, Windows, iOS, Android. So it's very versatile and very comprehensive.
Tom, one question we got is performance and latency important in this type of environment? Because sometimes you see systems that they say it's not important for these remote sites that are on WAN links.
It's absolutely important. And, if you have pressure relief valves that are connected to a controller that are connected to a pressure sensor, if the latency is too much, it could fail and you could have a blowout. And a blowout is really nasty in oil and gas. And the same thing with some of the Christmas tree that they have at some wellheads. So, performance really matters. And in IT, again, it doesn't matter if you get your email 3 or 5 seconds later, but in oil and gas and in critical infrastructure, process logic controllers, you need milliseconds or less in latency. So the other thing that I think is a guiding principle of the company, and many people aspire to this, but it's around simplicity. And I think my time at Apple really drove this home in a way that it would, you may intellectually understand the importance of simplicity, but until you get it beaten over your head for 10 years, it's a very different experience. And so, trying to make sure that we can actually have an 8-year-old deploy our hardware or software in the field, like that's what we're shooting for. We don't need to have a CCNA person who's deploying this. In terms of the ability to do, and one of the things that we've made decisions on is we work with our channel partners. So we have certified partners that actually will preload our software on their very low cost commodity boxes. And then this can be shipped to the field. A user can pull out everybody knows how to use the camera on their cell phone. They can just take a picture of the QR code that gets sent to the administrator, and it gets automatically linked up in the orchestrator and configured. So it's a very slick way to make things very simple to deploy. And I really believe that the main thing holding back this industry from security is mostly about ease of deployment and confidence that once they deploy this, it's going to actually be effective. So remote configuration management is very important. And then the ability to manage the systems and users, which, you have thousands of people and devices. We want to be able to do this with a single click. We want to have APIs that integrate into your Active Directory on the user side, as well as your asset management systems, let's say with a Dragos or with a Nozomi or a Darktrace. So trying to keep it simple is a really difficult problem. And I really am, and the guys will tell you on the team, that I'm kind of a pain in the ass when it comes to trying to avoid feature bloat. I want to make sure it's things that really matter. So I think this case study I've talked a little bit about, where they, tried to remotely configure hundreds of folks by a single administrator. What I didn't tell you is that this is something that is important in oil and gas and probably other industries around acquisitions. When you acquire a company, you need to protect them really fast. So we'll throw a security blanket over the newly acquired company very quickly, less than a month. And then after they have that kind of protective blanket, they can go through the process of rationalizing what will inevitably be disparate systems. So that kind of integration work that has to happen, you can do that in a secure way. And I mentioned how fast we were able to go, add 15,000 devices in less than a month. And this has actually given them a strategic advantage. They can acquire companies with less risk after they became a BlastWave customer than before. So the other thing that I think is important when I talk about hard to hack is that we have zero exposed web services. I mentioned that earlier. But getting rid of these threat vectors, this threat elimination strategy, where usernames and passwords are not something you have to worry about anymore. The vulnerabilities, the default usernames and passwords, the CVEs that are going to be forever day vulnerabilities, if those are cloaked, so they're unaddressable by both internal and external unauthenticated users, they're not going to be able to exploit you either. So it makes us much, much harder to attack than someone who's relying on industrial firewalls, which are simply managing source and destination traffic packets and trying to manage port security, as opposed to identity-based security, which is what we do. So let's geek out a little bit and look at some of these drawings. So one thing that, as you work in an industry for a while, you learn a lot more about their business. You learn about the technology. You learn, and patterns start to emerge. And one of the things that we've seen with oil and gas upstream in particular, and midstream to a certain extent, is that you have a lot of low-cost cellular satellite networks. A lot of people are wanting to use Skylink or Starlink, sorry. They're wanting to use Starlink for connectivity, and they need a way to do that securely. We can help them do that securely. And so that tension and friction between the IT and OT teams can be relieved. The other thing that's great about this solution for upstream and midstream is because there's thousands of devices, we can deploy both hardware and software for under $1,000 per site. I'm not going to mention specific names, but some of the OEM vendors who have, various industrial firewalls or whatever, they start at $2,000. So it's a non-starter. So this is a solution that we provide that has a lot of other benefits, but it's also hits the cost goals of our customers. And, this is just a more granular look on the bottom part, but it also enforces the fact that increasingly, you're really wanting these systems, the OT systems and the IT systems, to be connected so you can get the data out, you can manage it remotely. You don't have to have truck rolls going to far places in Alaska or in West Texas. You can get the connectivity without the risk. And, in unmanned drilling, it's absolutely essential, obviously. But in manned drilling cases, you want to have that same kind of connectivity as well. And then, obviously fracking is done at all these different facilities. It's just a way to extract more oil out of an existing well. And then in the office environment, people are also using us that. And there was an oil and gas customer who asked us, can we use you for the IT side? Because we love how well this is protecting the OT side. They had a pen tester come in, and the pen tester looked at all their different kind of risks and vulnerabilities. And the IT was like lit up like a Christmas tree. And on the OT side, they could do nothing. It was completely dark. And I think that's just a testament to this cloaking approach that we take so that it protects all those, what I think are vulnerable assets. And then this is just a kind of a midstream look at the same thing. Again, you have a lot of similar devices, PLCs, sensors, IP cameras, controllers, RTUs, HMIs. And the solution that we provide addresses all of those devices and allows granular access and control. In terms of downstream, the downstream looks a lot to me like our manufacturing customers. So these big refineries, they have very little downtime. So the downtime proposition of trying to deploy, the IEC 62443's critical zones and conduits is very difficult using firewalls in a refinery because they have such little downtime. Getting to steady state and maintaining that steady state as long as possible is very impactful on their bottom line profit. So maintaining uptime is something that we can also help facilitate, not just avoiding cyber attacks and downtime, but also in the deployment side. So just a kind of a overarching statement here. And I did a lot of things in my career. I started out at Caterpillar doing plastics and sound suppression engineering, and then I went to Eli Lilly and did manufacturing, safety. Then I went to a search engine company and did product management and Apple. And this is what I'm dedicating the rest of my life to, is protecting our critical infrastructure. It's so important. It's such a huge problem. And unlike almost every other business, you're not just doing business strategy, go to market, pricing, HR, channel strategy, product strategy. You've also got this wild card called the adversary. And it's never going to get boring. And I frankly think it's never going to get completely solved. But we are passionately engaged to try to protect our customers' critical infrastructure. And I'll tell you what, we take it personally when they get attacked. And there have never been a successful attack against a blast shield protected system, by the way. And that includes plants in which there was a massive ransomware attack directed at a facility that every other line went down except for the one protected by us. So I'm not saying it's foolproof, and I'm not encouraging hackers to come after us, but I am saying that we do have evidence that shows this shit works. And so it's really about operational continuity. It's about human health and safety and protecting our energy future, which is becoming more and more important. And so prioritizing cybersecurity strategies that have a high ROI, I think, is what we need to be pushing these days, as opposed to just this box checking approach, whether it's SOC 2 or some of these other things, because we really need to secure uninterrupted delivery of energy for the future generations. So with that, I just want to kind of mention that we are the gold standard right now for oil and gas. Our goal within the next year or so is to be at the point where every oil and gas CEO, if they get asked about this question, why, instead of saying, what is BlastWave or what do they do? Instead of saying, why are you not using BlastWave? That's where we want to be in just a few years. And the way we think we can do that is just by focusing on simplicity, making it easy to use, making it low cost, easy to deploy, easy to manage, and making sure it's hard to hack. So with that, Cam, if there's any additional questions, I'd love to take them.
Yeah, so we answered some of them that were offline technical ones. If anyone else has any other questions, I did inject the ones that kind of came in the appropriate places. But we did have a couple people ask about the slides. So if you want the slides, send it to cam@blastwave.com, and I'd be happy to share with you.
How much are we charging for that, Cam?
We're charging you for that internet access fee.
Okay.
But again, we definitely want to thank people for joining. I do think that a couple of things to just point out that Tom talked about during the session. Clearly the security issues and the nation state activities going on especially with things like Salt Typhoon, are a concern that have added a new wrinkle to the oil and gas concerns, especially in the WAN world, where just a simple SD-WAN connection isn't really secure enough anymore for sites like these. And clearly, with natural resources becoming such a big deal, making sure that they're protected are a big part of every company's and country's concerns right now.